Late spring of 1881 came quietly to Ashen Fork Basin. Fog still covered the lower pasture, but the south slope was alive with calves. Some stood close to their mothers. Some nursed. Others stumbled through the new grass on legs too long for their bodies. At the fence, Silas Rook, the largest cattleman in the valley, held his hat in both hands. Beside him stood Lyle Craven, the feed store man who had once bet that Orenvale's herd would be dead before the February thaw. Now Lyle had nothing to say. Near the cabin door, Mara Vale, Oren's wife, stood with flour still on her hands. Oren was not in the pasture taking praise. He was kneeling beside the water trough, tightening an old iron brace, while clear seep water ran over the stone lip. Silas finally spoke. I counted 27 before the fog lifted. Lyle's voice came rough. 27? Silas kept looking at the calves. Standing, nursing, strong enough to run. The hammer stopped. Oren tested the water with his fingers. Lyle looked across the pasture and swallowed. Those cows were supposed to be dead. Oren did not turn around. They were never dead. Silas looked at him then. What were they? Oren wiped mud from his hand and watched one young calf chase its mother through the grass. Unfinished. Months earlier, those same cows had stood in the Ashen Fork sale ring with ribs showing, coats dull, and coughs deep enough to make every rancher step back. That was the morning Orenvale spent his last dollars on 39 sickly cows, and the whole town laughed while he did it. Months earlier, winter still ruled Ashen Fork Basin. The cabin was cold enough for frost to cling to the inside corners of the windows. Mara Vale sat beside the table, carefully stitching another patch onto an almost empty flour sack. Only $31.70 remained. Etta Wren, the mercantile owner who kept half the valley alive on credit, still carried their debt of $286, with interest waiting beyond the spring thaw. Most people said the land was too sour, too windy, and too steep for cattle. Reverend Thaddeus Mott had offered the sensible answer. Sell the place. Pay what you owe. A good ranch will always need another hand. Mara never argued. She turned the last 3 silver coins toward Oren. Then she asked only one question. Did you check the limestone seep this morning? People around Ashen Fork called it the Sour Basin. They saw thin grass, hard wind, and hills that worked against every wagon and every herd. Oren saw something else. He knew which south-facing slope held sunlight until late afternoon. He knew the half-dead stand of cottonwoods still broke the worst of the north wind. He knew the limestone seep never froze completely, even after the coldest nights, leaving water just warm enough to matter. He knew the dry sedge growing along the marsh edge made better bedding than fresh-cut straw once winter settled in. Nothing on that land looked valuable by itself. But Oren had spent enough years watching it to understand that every forgotten piece belonged to the same machine. No one else had ever tried putting it together. But knowing the land was only half of what kept Oren from giving up on it. The other half was hidden in an old cedar box beneath his father's workbench, rolled tight in a strip of rawhide that had survived more winters than most men remembered. Oren crossed the cold cabin, pulled the box from the shadows, and brought the rawhide to the table. Mara held the lantern closer as he slipped off the faded cord and carefully unrolled it. The leather wasn't covered with words. It carried knife marks, long cuts, short cuts, tiny symbols burned into the edge, a circle for water, a cross for frost, small lines for hay, numbers carved beside each winter. One year stood out, 1864. His father had once explained those marks. They belonged to Ansel Creed, an aging Scottish-Irish cattleman who had survived winters that buried entire herds. Creed believed weak cattle rarely died from hunger first. They died because frightened owners tried to force strength back into them too quickly. Too much grain, too little movement, wet bedding, frozen water, everything done with urgency, nothing done with patience. His father never repeated Creed's lessons as sayings. He repeated them as habits. Restore the rumen before the weight. Keep the bedding dry before keeping it warm. Make water easy to drink. Let weak cattle walk a little beneath the afternoon sun. Never ask a struggling animal to live at the pace of a healthy one. Oren ran his thumb across the old knife marks. For a moment, they felt less like measurements, and more like the rough outline of his father's hand, still pointing the way through another hard winter. On a bitter morning in late November, the sale yard at Ashen Fork was already crowded before noon. Harlan Pike, a tired rancher selling off stock he no longer wanted to winter, drove 39 thin cows into the ring. Their winter coats looked dull. Several coughed. One limped. Another stood with her head hanging low, while the others drifted around her. Benton Crow, the sale yard auctioneer, tried to raise the bidding anyway. 39 bred cows, he called. Who's starting? Nobody answered. Silas Rook leaned against the fence rail. A sick cow eats like debt, he said loudly enough for half the yard to hear, and calves like a prayer. Laughter rolled through the crowd. The price dropped again. Still no hands. Oren stepped forward. I'll take the lot. The laughter stopped for only a heartbeat before returning even louder. It took every dollar in his pocket. It still wasn't enough. Without a word, Etta Wren stepped beside him and handed Benton the remaining amount. I'll collect it later, she said quietly. The gavel struck. Sold. As the cows shuffled toward the holding pen, Lyle Craven folded his arms and grinned. I'll wager they don't make it to the February thaw. Someone laughed. Someone else answered. He didn't buy cattle. He bought himself a pasture full of graves. Mara lowered her eyes and turned away before anyone could see the hurt on her face. Oren never looked back. He simply walked toward the 39 cows that nobody else wanted. The drive back to Ashen Fork took the rest of the day. 39 weak cows could not be pushed like a healthy herd. Before they reached the first creek crossing, one old cow slipped on the frozen stones and dropped heavily to her knees. Two others stopped at the base of a long hill and refused to climb another step. Several men watching from the road shook their heads. Oren never reached for a whip. He broke the herd into smaller groups instead. The strongest moved first. The weakest followed after they had rested. Whenever the trail opened onto a patch of afternoon sunlight, he stopped the herd for a few quiet minutes before moving again. No shouting. No panic. Mara stayed behind the cattle for nearly every mile. She gathered dropped lead ropes, closed every gate, and counted heads each time the herd started moving again. By the time the sun slipped behind the western ridge, the cattle finally crossed into the lower pasture below the cabin. They looked no healthier than they had that morning. Their ribs still showed. Their coats were still rough. Several still coughed into the cold evening air. But every one of them was standing. As darkness settled across the basin, Mara counted one last time. 39. The word barely rose above a whisper. Only then did she let out the breath she had been holding since the auction yard. Oren never planned to keep the cattle inside a closed barn. Warm air trapped too tightly became wet air. Wet air settled into hides, bedding, and lungs. His father had warned him about that, long before he understood why. The recovery yard took shape beneath the half-dead cottonwoods, where the north wind first lost its strength. The hillside formed the back wall. Flat limestone slabs lifted the bedding above the frozen ground. Rows of woven willow hurdles broke the wind without stopping the air completely. Blocks of cut sod sealed the lower gaps where drafts slipped through. Mara mixed clay, straw, and mud into a thick plaster, pressing it deep between the stones with bare hands until every crack disappeared. An old canvas wagon cover became the entrance curtain. It moved with the wind instead of fighting it. The bedding came last. Clean straw formed the base. Dry marsh sedge added another layer. Wood ash from the stove spread across the top to pull moisture away before it could settle. Nothing about the shelter looked impressive. Every piece existed for one purpose: to keep the cattle dry. Jonas Bell, the basin's blacksmith and wheelwright, was a quiet man who trusted iron more than opinion. He stopped by 2 days later with a pair of forged hinges and a heavy brace for the water trough. He studied the windbreak for a long moment before fastening the hardware into place. "You aren't building a barn," he finally said. Oren shook his head. "I'm building time." That first night, the north wind arrived exactly as expected. It pushed against the cottonwoods, rattled the canvas, and searched every corner for a way inside. Before sunrise, Oren carried the lantern into the shelter. Frost covered the outside edge of the canvas curtain. It reached the first row of stones. Then it stopped. He knelt and pressed his hand into the bedding. Warm. More importantly, dry. Without a word, he unrolled the old rawhide tally strap. One fresh knife mark, 39 alive. North wind, bedding dry. The first measurement of the winter had been earned. The first few mornings looked almost disappointing. The cattle did not suddenly stand taller. Their ribs did not disappear. Nothing about them suggested a miracle. Oren expected exactly that. Weak cattle rarely recovered because they were fed too little. More often, they were fed too much, too fast. Every morning began with clean prairie hay. Only a light handful of oat chaff followed. Small pieces of chopped turnip were mixed through the hay instead of piled on top. Molasses scraps were thinned with warm seep water until they coated the feed instead of soaking it. Near the shelter gate, Oren packed wood ash and salt into a single mineral block where every cow could reach it. For the few animals that still carried a rough winter cough, Mara brewed weak willow bark tea and mixed only enough into their drinking water to soften the edge of the irritation. Heavy grain never appeared. Not once. Oren trusted healthy digestion more than quick weight. He judged each cow the same way every day. His hand checked the fill along the left side. His eyes watched how long each animal chewed its cud. Fresh manure told another part of the story. So did clear eyes. So did steady breathing. Inside the cabin, Mara built a pegboard from scrap pine. One row marked eating. Another marked off feed. A third marked coughing. Every evening, the pegs moved. Some days only one. Some days several. 3 mornings later, Mara noticed one of the oldest cows walk slowly toward the salt block. The animal had ignored it since arriving. This time, she lowered her head and began licking it without hesitation. Mara watched quietly. She never called for Oren. She waited until the cow finished before moving a single peg. Small changes had learned to earn her trust. Silas Rook rode into Ashen Fork 3 days later. He stopped beside the fence, as though he had come to ask about a broken corner post. Neither man believed that was the reason. Silas rested both arms on the top rail and looked across the recovery yard. The cows were still thin. Their coats were still rough. 1 or 2 coughed now and then. To most eyes, nothing had changed. Silas broke the silence. Winter feed will bury you before sickness buries them. Oren kept spreading fresh bedding beneath the windbreak. Maybe. Silas frowned. You've got 39 mouths eating every day. Every bale goes into cattle that may never pay you back. Oren finally stood and brushed the straw from his gloves. I'm not trying to make them fat before Christmas. Silas waited. I only need them healthy enough to reach calving. For a long moment, the only sound between them was the slow breathing of cattle and the north wind moving through the cottonwoods. Silas looked at Oren the way a man looked at someone carrying another load of debt into an already sinking house. Without another word, he climbed back into the saddle and rode away. From the cabin doorway, Mara had heard every word. She watched Silas disappear beyond the ridge before turning to Oren. What if he's right? Oren looked across the recovery yard, where another cow lowered her head into the hay. His answer came without hesitation. Then we'll know before anyone else does. 3 days of wet snow changed everything. The temperature hovered just above freezing during the day, then dropped again after sunset. The shelter stayed warm. Too warm. When Oren walked inside before dawn, he stopped after only 2 steps. Something felt wrong. The air was heavy, not cold. Heavy. A deep cough echoed from the far corner. Then another. One cow stood trembling, even though the north wind never reached her. Oren dropped to one knee, and pulled back the top layer of bedding. The straw underneath was damp. The moisture had nowhere to go. He had protected the cattle from the wind, but he hadn't given the damp air enough room to escape. His father had once warned him that cold could be survived. Wet cold was different. It worked slowly, quietly, and it almost always won. "There it is," Oren said softly. "The mistake." There was no anger, no panic, only work. Before daylight reached the basin, he and Mara stripped out every wet layer. Fresh limestone slabs raised the bedding another few inches above the frozen ground. Dry marsh sedge was mixed with clean straw. Wood ash was scattered through every new layer to pull moisture away before it settled. Then Oren cut a narrow vent low along the sheltered side of the yard, giving damp air a path to leave without inviting the north wind inside. The work lasted until well after midnight. Neither of them slept. Mara knelt in soaked straw so long that her hands turned red from the cold. Still, she kept the lantern raised while Oren watched the weakest cow breathe, slowly, steadily. Morning arrived beneath a pale gray sky. This time, a thin ribbon of moisture drifted through the new vent instead of settling into the bedding. Oren reached down and pressed his palm into the fresh straw. Dry. Across the shelter, the two coughing cows still cleared their throats, but the coughs were shorter now, farther apart. The shelter had taught them another lesson. Keeping cattle warm was never enough. Keeping them dry was what allowed them to stay alive. The next cold spell found a different weakness. Before sunrise, a thin sheet of ice had formed around the edges of the watering trough. The center still held water, but the weakest cows hesitated. They nudged the ice with their noses, took one quick drink, then stepped away. One old cow barely drank at all. Oren watched her leave the trough with her head still low. The problem wasn't the amount of water. It was the effort required to reach it. Cold water demanded more from a weak animal than it could afford to give. That afternoon, Oren walked back to the limestone seep. Instead of carrying buckets, he reshaped a shallow stone channel that guided the slow flow into a broad basin resting inside a small pocket of afternoon sunlight. Each evening, Mara covered the basin with woven willow mats to slow the night's freezing. The following day, Jonas Bell arrived, carrying a heavy iron brace. Without saying much, he bolted it beneath the stone trough so it would not shift or collapse when several cows crowded in at once. Before leaving, he watched the water run for a long moment. "Simple," he said. Oren nodded. "It has to be." Using his knife, Oren carved a small notch into the side of the trough. Every morning afterward, he checked the water level before doing anything else. No guessing, only measurement. 2 days later, the same old cow walked to the basin again. This time, she lowered her head without hesitation. She drank. Then she kept drinking. Neither Oren nor Mara spoke. The quiet sound of flowing water was enough to tell them the system had found another answer. Snow covered the road when Etta Wren arrived with a flour sack balanced across the back of her wagon. Beneath it sat a small bag of beans and a wrapped block of tallow. She found Mara stirring a nearly empty pot over the stove, while Oren slept on a fence post beside the recovery yard, his hat pulled low against the wind. Etta didn't mention the exhaustion written all over them. She just dropped the heavy flour sack onto the table. "Back in town, Lyle Craven has started taking wagers," Etta said evenly. 3-1. "He claims your herd will never live to see the February thaw." She dusted the flour from her sleeves. I took the other side. Mara stopped stirring the pot and looked up. "You bet on us?" "I bet on discipline," Etta answered. That evening, the three of them spread ledgers, tally marks, and feed counts across the kitchen table. They counted hay. They counted debt. They counted the days remaining before calving season. The numbers were close, closer than Mara liked. When they finished, Etta folded the ledger shut. "If these cows make it," she said, "don't sell the calves because people feel sorry for you." Oren looked across the table. "I won't." "Good," Etta replied. "Pity is cheap. Good stock isn't." Before she left, Mara ladled beans into 3 bowls. It was the first hot meal that had filled their table in several days. Mara lowered her head over the bowl before taking the first bite. Not because she was hungry, because if she looked up, the tears she had held back all winter might finally be seen. The change was almost too small to notice. A few of the cows were chewing longer. Their eyes looked brighter. They walked to the hay without being urged. For the first time in weeks, Orrin allowed himself to believe they were turning the corner. He added a little more oat chaff to the morning ration. It wasn't much. By noon, one of the older cows had stopped eating. She stood apart from the herd, her left side swollen tight beneath her ribs. Every few moments, she shifted her weight, stretched her neck, then looked back toward her own belly. Orrin reached her before she tried to lie down. His hand told him what his eyes already suspected. He had hurried the feed. Only by a little. It had been enough. Without wasting another minute, the extra chaff disappeared from every feed bucket. Clean prairie hay replaced it. Instead of 2 larger meals, the cattle received several smaller ones throughout the day. When the afternoon sun reached the south-facing slope, Orrin walked the weakest animals slowly across the hillside, giving their rumens time to settle instead of forcing them to work harder. The swollen cow moved stiffly at first. By sunset, she lowered her head and pulled another mouthful of hay. The tightness along her side had begun to ease. That evening, Orrin unrolled the old rawhide tally strap. He studied the empty space for a moment before cutting 4 simple words into the leather. Too much, too soon. Mara stood beside him longer than usual. She didn't read the older marks. She kept looking at the newest one. Later, after checking the herd one last time, Orrin rested his forehead against the weathered fence post outside the shelter. The wind had finally gone quiet. Mara came out carrying a bucket of fresh water. As she passed him, her hand rested lightly against his back for only a second. Neither of them spoke. A moment later, the sound of water pouring into the trough quietly filled the darkness. February arrived without mercy. The north wind swept across Ashen Fork until the creek disappeared beneath thick ice. Snow gathered against the cottonwoods, bending branches that had already survived too many winters. Down at the feed store, Lyle Craven kept repeating the same prediction to anyone willing to listen. "Wait for the thaw," he said. "You'll find bones where Orrin expected calves." The story spread through town far more easily than the truth. Out at the recovery yard, every sunrise began the same way. Orrin checked the frost creeping across the entrance curtain. It still stopped at the stone threshold instead of reaching the bedding. Mara moved another peg across the board before daylight had fully reached the basin. More cows were eating. Fewer had turned away from their hay. The limestone seep continued its slow, steady run beneath a thin ribbon of steam, untouched by the frozen creek, only a few hundred yards away. There were no sudden miracles. The cows were still gaunt, their heavy, swollen bellies pulling tight against ribs that still showed through rough coats. The debt was still waiting. Winter had not grown kinder. Yet each morning ended with the same count, 39. One by one, the cows lifted their heads as fresh hay was spread across the shelter. Mara whispered the final number under her breath. She turned toward the cabin before Orrin could see her lower lip begin to tremble. There were no victories to celebrate. Only another day that had not been surrendered. The first sign was easy to miss. 3 cows carried the same faint cough, but only one had begun leaving hay behind. Orrin caught it before the sickness spread, separating the animals into a smaller pen near the windbreak. The problem was contained. The workload wasn't. By then, every hour belonged to something that could not wait. Water, feed, bedding, repairs, observation. Even a careful pair of hands could only be in one place at a time. 2 mornings later, Hester Bloom, a widowed neighbor, arrived at the gate with her 13-year-old son, Eli. Years of caring for milk goats had taught Hester to notice the smallest changes. She could spot an animal losing its appetite long before its body gave up. Eli had a different gift. He watched the ground as much as the herd. Before the week ended, He stopped beside a fresh line of tracks and pointed toward one cow. "She's shortening her left step." Orrin watched the animal cross the yard again. Eli was right. A bruised hoof had barely begun to swell. One afternoon of rest saved what could have become weeks of trouble. From then on, Hester and Eli came 3 mornings each week. Cash was scarce, so Orrin paid what he could, added a share of fresh milk whenever there was enough, and promised winter beef when the season finally turned. The recovery yard felt different after that. Work still filled every hour. But some mornings, Mara heard Eli speaking softly to a nervous cow while he checked her feet. For the first time since winter settled over Ashen Fork, the wind was no longer the only voice drifting through the yard. The first calf chose the hardest night of the winter. A bitter wind swept down from the ridge after sunset, curling around the shelter entrance instead of passing over it. The canvas curtains snapped against the posts, and cold air slipped through faster than before. Orrin noticed it immediately. He fastened a second hide curtain behind the first, and pulled another woven willow baffle across the opening, narrowing the path the wind could find. Only then did he return to the cow. She was the weakest in the herd. Now she was calving. Mara held the lantern low, while Hester spread clean burlap across the fresh bedding. The calf arrived wet and silent. For a long second, it didn't move. Orrin slipped the old pocket watch from his coat. Time mattered now. Hester rubbed the calf hard with the burlap until water no longer clung to its coat. Mara steadied the cow, while Orrin worked warmth back into the calf's legs with both hands, flexing each joint before guiding its nose toward its mother's scent. The first attempt failed. The second nearly did. Almost an hour passed before the calf gathered its legs beneath itself. It swayed once, twice. Then it found its balance. A moment later, its nose reached the udder. The first pull of milk was almost too quiet to hear. Behind them, Eli opened the old coffee tin resting on a shelf beside the lantern. He dropped a single pebble inside. The small click of stone against metal barely carried beyond the shelter. Mara heard it anyway. She would remember that sound, long after the winter was gone. The first calf was never the promise. The weeks that followed were, one by one, the cows entered labor. Some deliveries ended quietly before sunrise. Others stretched deep into the night. One newborn grew cold before it found its feet, forcing Mara to keep rubbing its coat beneath a blanket while Hester warmed fresh cloth by the stove. Another cow refused to let her calf nurse until Orrin calmly guided her into a narrow corner of the shelter where she could no longer keep turning away. Spring arrived slowly, bringing a different kind of trouble. Afternoon thaw turned parts of the lower pasture into deep mud. 2 young calves lost their footing there on the same day. By evening, Orrin had opened a new path toward the higher south-facing slope, where the ground dried sooner and the sun lingered longer. The work never became easier, it simply became familiar. Each time a calf stood on its own and found its mother's milk within the first hour, Eli reached for the old coffee tin. Another pebble, another quiet click. Days passed. Then, weeks. The little tin no longer sounded hollow when he lifted it. Beyond the shelter, small calves began chasing each other through patches of fresh grass, stopping only when their mothers called them back. One evening, Mara picked up the coffee tin while clearing the table. Its weight surprised her. She held it for a moment before setting it down again, gently enough that not a single pebble inside made a sound. By early spring, the story had traveled farther than the cattle ever had. People no longer laughed about the 39 sick cows. They asked questions instead. Calder Wynn, a trail boss moving cattle farther south later that year, arrived one clear morning without saying much about why he had come. He ignored the pasture at first. His attention stayed on the calves. He watched how they stood, how they walked, how quickly they found their mothers, how full their bellies looked after nursing. Nothing escaped his eyes. Riding beside him was Dr. Amos Ketch, an aging stock doctor whose opinions carried weight across 3 counties. He spent nearly an hour inside the recovery yard. His boots pressed into the bedding. His fingers tested the salt block. He followed the limestone seep to the shallow basin where the cattle drank. He pulled apart a handful of hay, smelled it, then watched one cow settle down to chew her cud. Finally, he looked toward Orrin. Most men try to save a sick cow by putting weight back on her. His weathered hand rested against the fence. You started somewhere else. Orrin waited. Ketch nodded toward the herd. You brought the rumen back before the weight. You gave them dry ground before warm walls. You let them remember how to live. Calder glanced across the pasture, where another calf broke into an awkward run before stopping beside its mother. I'd like first choice of a group of those calves this fall, he said. Orrin never answered right away. Behind the shelter doorway, Mara heard every word. She quietly folded the feed ledger closed, knowing the proof they had waited all winter for no longer belonged only to their family. A week later, Silas Rook rode through the gate again. This time, he didn't stop at the fence to study the cattle. His eyes followed two young calves racing across the south pasture before they circled back to their mothers. He watched them long enough to be certain they weren't lucky. Then he turned toward Orrin. Harlan Pike still has a few bred cows left, he said. They aren't pretty. Orrin smiled faintly. They don't have to be. Silas gave a slow nod. They're carrying. Most folks won't look twice until the auction crowd starts paying attention. The offer hung between them. It wasn't advice. It wasn't business. It was the closest thing Silas knew to admitting he had judged a man too quickly. Before either of them spoke again, Mara stepped out of the cabin with a folded letter. It came from Sweetwater. The handwriting belonged to Nolan Greer, a ranch buyer known for paying only after seeing stock with his own eyes. He had heard enough about the recovery herd to make the trip himself. The letter was short. He wanted to inspect several cow-calf pairs before the fall drive and discuss buying the first group of calves if they continued developing the way people claimed. Orrin folded the letter and slipped it into his coat. For months, every decision had been about surviving the next morning. Now, a different question stood waiting. How could the herd grow without sacrificing the careful habits that had brought it this far? Silas rested one hand on the top rail before climbing back into the saddle. Neither man mentioned the auction. Neither man mentioned the laughter. Across the pasture, another calf broke into an awkward run. Silas watched it for a moment, then tipped his hat and rode home. By the first weeks of summer, Ashen Fork looked different. The south pasture no longer belonged to Silence. Calves wandered through knee-high grass, stopping to nurse before breaking into another clumsy run. Their coats had filled out. They grew the way young cattle were supposed to grow. Not every one of the 39 cows had recovered perfectly. A few would always carry the marks of the winter that had nearly finished them. But enough had lived. Enough had calved. Enough healthy calves now covered the pasture that no one could dismiss the herd as a mistake. Back at the feed store, Lyle Craven found other things to talk about. The wagers had quietly disappeared. At the next sale, Benton Crow spotted Orrin before the bidding began. His voice carried across the yard with a different kind of respect. "Morning, Mr. Vale." Nothing more needed to be said. Later that week, Etta Wren sat at the kitchen table. No coins changed hands. Instead, Etta opened her ledger and crossed out all the accumulated winter interest. "The calves are running," she said. "I don't charge interest to folks who keep their word." The principal debt was still there, but it no longer felt like a life sentence. When she closed the book, she smiled for only a moment. "Keep raising cattle this way," she said. "The ledger will catch up." After she left, Mara picked up the old rawhide tally strap. Its surface carried an entire winter. Knife marks, weather marks, small reminders of every mistake that had become another correction. She rolled it carefully and placed it back inside the cedar box. Orrin watched her close the lid. Then he reached over, opened it again, and took the strap back out. There would be another winter, another herd, another season, waiting to ask the same hard questions. Outside, calves called to their mothers across the pasture. Orrin walked past the gate without looking toward the road, where a few riders had stopped to admire the herd. Instead, He knelt beside the old watering trough and tightened the iron brace Jonas Bell had forged months before. Clear seep water slipped over the stone lip and spread into the basin exactly as it had all winter. The pasture answered with the quiet sound of calves nursing beneath the morning sun. Nature had already delivered its verdict. It had never been about buying 39 sickly cows. It had been about seeing the life that everyone else had mistaken for loss.